My name is Jonathan Haber. I'm a educational consultant and researcher. I've written books on critical thinking, including Critical Thinking from MIT Press and Critical Voter, which uses which uses election politics to teach critical thinking skills. My background is I've been an entrepreneur. I ran a company that provided educational and employment assessments for 20 years. After I sold that, I worked in educational publishing. My most recent job was helping to get a new graduate school of education off the ground in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in partnership between Woodrow Wilson Foundation in Princeton, New Jersey, and MIT. And most recently, I've been doing work with academic standards and critical thinking education, including work with the Jews. I've always been interested in critical thinking in the abstract. I think even when I was working in the assessment business and sort of testing employers and students, there was components beyond knowledge. There were aspects of the sort of human condition that involved kind of rigorous thinking. I didn't really have a vocabulary for it then, but I found it sort of important and interesting. It was only later when I started working primarily in education. Actually, I could sort of trace it back to the 2008 election when I was following politics in our house, as we often do, but sort of becoming aware for the first time how people's decision-making processes were not sort of being, decisions weren't being made through sort of deliberation debate. It was more about sort of loyalty to a particular party or kind of doing what we had always done. So over the next several years, I explored that further. And by the time of the 2012 election, I had actually developed a curriculum called Critical Voter, which used the election politics of that year's election, presidential election, to teach critical thinking skills. That's when I really kind of developed a set of what I call practical critical thinking skills and distilled that into a set of lessons that were delivered in a podcast with an associated curriculum and quizzes and other material. In 2016, I turned that into a book, Critical Voter, which was updated again recently in 2020. But most recently, I've been exploring critical thinking, not so much from the how-to skills. That's something that I've been kind of working on all along, but also taking a look at more fundamental questions. What is critical thinking? Can it be taught? Can it be assessed? What's getting in the way of critical thinking being a larger aspect of K-12 and higher ed education? And so that's the work I've been doing most recently, is trying to find ways to insert critical thinking instruction more deliberately into traditional academic subjects. Well, another audience that I think critical thinking is vital for is journalists, but also media consumers, producers and consumers of the media. Because as we talked about, or people have seen over certainly this last election cycle, but really I've seen going back 20 years or more, is the electorate is becoming more polarized. We're becoming more distrustful of news sources. We don't know kind of what to believe anymore. And I would fundamentally say that this is a crisis, not necessarily of fake news. I don't even really like that term because it conflates a whole bunch of reasons a news story can be wrong and a whole bunch of reasons people might publish a story that's incorrect, from simple human error to trying to deceive. But I'd say it's fair to say we as news consumers have a responsibility to do the work, do the fact checking, do the analysis to determine what news sources, where we want to get our news from. The reason critical thinking is so important is critical thinking certainly is concerned with facts, with facts being true or false, with evidence. But that's only part of the story. There's many cases, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, even in the news coverage we watch or read, or editorials, or political speeches. There are many times when true facts are marshaled to deceive, or true facts are given in support of a incorrect or even a false conclusion. And that's where critical thinking comes in, because many of the things we read, not just editorials, but even news articles, they're all trying to persuade you that something is true, right? Even a weather report is trying to persuade you that predictions for tomorrow are correct based on weather data from today. Okay, so those are arguments. Okay, an argument is a set of facts called premises leading to a conclusion. Okay, and the thing connecting the premises to that conclusion is reason for belief. And really, critical thinking, one of the key critical thinking skills is taking an argument, whether it's an editorial or a news story or political speech, turning it into a structured format so that it can be analyzed for quality, it can be analyzed for strength. And that's what you need critical thinking skills for. You also need critical thinking skills to evaluate information well. Those are vital skills in the modern media literacy toolkit. You also need to be able to perform research and determine when information you're getting, particularly from online sources, is relevant or accurate or timely. Those are information literacy skills that are also key critical thinking skills. So if you want to be an intelligent consumer of the news, you need to be a critical thinker. And I would go further and say that if you want to be a good journalist, fact checking alone is not going to do it. There's too much going on in the world other than facts that are true and false. You need to understand that as a journalist, you are analyzing and making arguments, and you have to understand what that means from a critical thinking perspective. Well, to be a good critical thinker, you obviously need skills, right? You need to understand how to organize your thinking, how to analyze evidence, how to analyze arguments, those kind of things. But you also need a set of what are called critical thinking dispositions. These are kind of personal characteristics that lend oneself to being a critical thinker, to using the critical thinking skills, even when you might prefer not to, right? Even when you, for instance, are confronted with something that challenges a very fundamental belief. Those are times when you might not want to apply critical thinking skills. You might just want to believe what you've always believed, or ignore evidence that contradicts what you want to believe. And that's very, very common. That is a bias that is part of the human condition. We all have it. It's called confirmation bias. But a disposition that helps you get away from these biases, or at least control for them, is empathy, right? If you empathize with somebody else, then that means you may be open to their opinion, even if you disagree with it. If you empathize with other people, you may be able to engage in dialogue with them, even over something where you have a fundamental disagreement, right? So empathy, curiosity, open-mindedness, these are all required to be a critical thinker. In fact, I would say it doesn't matter how skilled you are, how knowledgeable you are at logic, for example, how skilled you are at applying it. If you aren't ready to apply those skills to important matters because you don't want to challenge your own beliefs, for example, then you can't be a critical thinker. So I think empathy is vital to personally being a critical thinker, but it also is vital to engaging in civil dialogue, engaging in real argumentation, which fundamentally is a cooperative enterprise. People who argue are all trying to accomplish a common goal, even if they have fundamentally different ways of accomplishing that goal, and even if they never agree. Well, I think if we take a look at this last election, but even the sort of degeneration of elections over the last 10 or 20 years, I think one can make a case that something is missing in the civil dialogue, right? We have sorted ourselves into communities of the like-minded. There was a book many years ago called The Big Sort about how Americans are increasingly moving to communities where most people agree with them politically, right? More than half of us used to live in towns that would go either way in a political election. Now, a majority, probably a vast majority of us live in places where one candidate beats the other, or one party beats the other by a landslide, which means we're not exposed to ideas that differ from our beliefs, at least in terms of politics. And that's a problem. Even more so now that we watch cable news shows that cater to our prejudices or existing beliefs. We subscribe to online news services or newspapers that tell us what we want to hear, that don't really challenge us. Okay, and that leaves us highly, highly polarized. People talk about politics being polarized. People talk about politics being tribal. Okay, and this is what this comes from. This is the result of us sort of wallowing in our biases. And this is one of the reasons elections have become so fraught, right? We don't even sort of debate issues much anymore, other than to figure out, well, what side is the other tribe on, and whatever they're for, I'm against it. You could see how bizarre, this last election was, and part of it was because kind of substantive topics were very rarely discussed. So if we want to be better citizens, we need to have critical thinking dispositions, right? We have to be open-minded to the possibility that people who we disagree with, even about important matters, might have some important points to make, right? We have to believe that engaging with other people's ideas and talking them out and arguing them, even if we may not convince the other side of something, is still worthwhile. That's what a political campaign should look like. Substantive issues should be debated. We shouldn't be kind of looking for a flub somebody made in an off moment and blowing that up and putting that all over the internet, or using somebody, when somebody's misspoken, using that to anchor a TV commercial, right? A civil citizenship or a proper election among sort of the citizenship should be engaging with the most important issues of the day, not focusing on trivia, right? We should be doing what's called critical thinking circles, charitable argumentation. We should be charitable towards opponents, not charitable in terms of believing everything anybody says, but charitable in terms of engaging people's strongest arguments rather than sort of dwelling on some flaw or finding some weakness, much less an embarrassing moment, and basing our entire kind of campaign or political arguments based on that, or based on stereotypes, or based on parodies of somebody we don't like. So I think, if we want to kind of revitalize democracy, and this is a very old idea, this goes back to an intellectual from the early 20th century called John Dewey, who invented the concept of critical thinking, and he applied it in probably the most famous book in education called Democracy in Education. And fundamentally, it says that in order to have a democracy, we need citizens who are taught to think properly in order to engage in their civic responsibilities. And how do you think properly? Well, you use a technique that Dewey invented called critical thinking. Well, critical thinking is one of what's called 4C skills, include critical thinking, but also communication, collaboration, and creativity. And these are the skills that employers are today saying are the most important skills they want graduates to have. Critical thinking, for example, 75% of employers claim that the students they're hiring who just graduated after 12, 16 or more years of college do not have adequate critical thinking and problem solving abilities, even though 90 to 99% of educators claim creating critical thinkers is their top educational priority. So we have a commonality that educators and employers all think critical thinking is vital. But we have a disconnect in terms of educators who are prioritizing it, but not necessarily succeeding in training students to become critical thinkers. So that's one area. Why are employers saying critical thinking is so vital? Well, in the past education, you would learn facts, right? You'd memorize dates, you learn names, you understand history, you understand mathematical or scientific formulas, so you could plug data into them. But now all those facts are just a phone swipe away, right? We're all carrying a million libraries of Alexandria in our pocket. So it's not so much knowing the facts or being able to regurgitate them. It's the ability to find the facts, evaluate it for evidence for quality, plug it into, say, a logical argument in order to make good decisions. Those are the skills that people need, and those are critical thinking skills. They are only going to get more important as, say, artificial intelligence starts taking some of the mental work off the table, just the same way previous machines have reduced the need for physical human labor. So in those cases, what makes humans distinct from the machines that might be able to process insurance claims forms or even perform medical diagnosis? It's our ability to kind of get beyond the simple sort of obvious connections between things and really explore. And that involves critically thinking about a question, but also being able to think creatively to solve a problem, to be able to work with others, to communicate, to collaborate. Okay, those are the skills that are going to be most vital for students who, if you assume elementary school kids are going to get jobs in companies, industries, maybe whole product categories that don't exist today. It's vital that we be able to deal with the future, not just sort of regurgitate data that we've memorized and probably forgotten in the past. Well, I think the health crisis is a perfect example of why critical thinking is so vital, right? Because we have to make decisions about what to do in the future, right? We have to make decisions about, for instance, do schools reopen or how do they reopen? We'll have to make decisions about how to distribute vaccines, right? Even decisions we made about social distancing or locking down parts of the economy, right? These are all decisions we're making about the future. And as I often say, you can't fact check the future, right? You have to argue different positions about what to do in the future. School opening is a perfect example, right? A friend of mine wrote a book about how there are over 50 different ways schools can reopen in terms of when they reopen, how they reopen, who's online, who's coming in live, how you stagger things, et cetera, right? And we have to make decisions over which of these many options to choose. Well, you can't fact check things you haven't tried yet, right? You have to make an argument why it's superior, for example, to let freshmen in versus seniors, or to go online entirely versus opening the schools where infections could increase, or why it's important to have prioritize elementary schools being open because those are students who don't learn as well online, et cetera, et cetera. There are all positions that, you can't necessarily perform a scientific experiment and determine kind of which one of these is, the right answer before you do it. You have to argue positions and then make a choice based on the strongest argument, which is what we've been doing, right? And what's it called when you argue a position and analyze that argument to determine its strength? That's critical thinking. I think, throughout this health crisis, we've been having to make decision after decision, and some decisions have been done well, many of them have not done so well, but it's all about the same thing. It's sort of finding evidence, analyzing its quality, organizing it into an argument, analyzing that argument for strength and weakness, making a decision, and then understanding that that decision is going to set the whole chain going again, where you're going to have to, that decision is going to generate new evidence that you're going to have to evaluate in order to make a subsequent decision. That process, and if you think about the critical thinking as a systematic process, that is a way that you solve problems effectively. You don't get the answer right every single time, but you're much less likely to continue making the same errors over and over again. You know, critical thinking is very, very similar to other subjects, is that they build on each other. You know, if you think of a student studying English, right, even if you look at English standard or ELA standards like Common Core, every year you are kind of building on the same skill set. You might have very simple skills in early years, right, writing individual letters. Then as you get into fifth grade, you are kind of writing entire sentences and paragraphs have to hang together. As you get into middle school, you'll be writing multi-paragraph essays that have to follow a certain logical order. And then when you get into high school, you'll be writing long essays that need to be logical and coherent as well as persuasive, right? So that's all building off of the same skills. And critical thinking is the same thing, right? In early grades, you know, for instance, argumentation, in early grades, that's where you might want to teach students that in addition to evidence, you know, that are facts that could be proven true or false, and opinions, which are, say, conclusions you come to believe, not necessarily for because you've been arguing into them, they're just things you believe. In fact, the world is broken into evidence, which are the premises of a logical argument, and conclusions. You know, premises are the things I'm asking you to believe in an argument. A conclusion is something I'm saying you should or must believe if you accept the premises. Okay, and then connecting the two are reasons for belief. Simple example I like to use: if somebody says we've been locked down for months and coronavirus deaths keep going up, clearly social distancing isn't working. Okay, that's an argument. It's got two premises. Like, we've been locked down for months is one premise. Coronavirus deaths have gone up during that time. That's a second premise. And the conclusion is social distancing isn't working. Okay. So there you've got your premises and you've got your conclusion, right? And if you look at that argument, you could fact check the premises, but the premises are true, right? We have been locked down for months and coronavirus deaths have gone up during that period, right? You could fact check that all day long. There's nothing wrong with that argument that derives from the facts being wrong. The problem is those facts do not provide enough reasons to believe the conclusion. Okay, the argument fails because it's invalid. Okay, and I think young learners can understand that there exists this thing called reasons for belief, right? It's not, the world's not divided just into facts and opinions. It's not just facts that can be proven true or false and everything's just an opinion, right? It's not my opinion that social distancing has failed. It's not just somebody's opinion. It is a conclusion that's not supported in arguments. Okay, so that's a vital critical thinking skill, to realize that arguments can be strong or weak just the same way facts can be true or false. Now, fifth graders don't have to have a hugely sophisticated understanding of that. They just have to understand the world's not divided into facts and opinions. The world's divided into facts and arguments can be strong or weak for a variety of reasons. As you get into middle school, you can learn about those reasons, right? You can understand that the connection between premises and a conclusion. First, you can start learning that vocabulary of premises or conclusions. You could also start analyzing why premises might support or not support a conclusion. As you get into high school, you could be using this yourself. You can analyze arguments and identify named fallacies, for example, which is one of the typical reasons a argument does not support the conclusion, because the logic has a fallacy. It's fallacious. You can start using that specific terminology. You can start building your own writing around not just straight outlines, sort of how sentences are going to be organized, but how your arguments are going to be arranged. You can analyze your own arguments for strength and weakness. So that's a kind of typical trajectory for how a critical thinking skill, argumentation, can be sort of built up from early grades to higher grades. Other critical thinking skills can follow the same trajectory, whether it's research skills that can begin with simple kind of information lookup, how to identify if facts are true or false, up through much more sophisticated analysis that would use the whole panoply of information literacy skills to evaluate the data, the information that you might use in your own research. I think you could start by taking an inventory, right? You can take a look at a decision you've made recently. Let's say you're, you know, high school senior or junior exploring colleges, right? You could start to think about, well, how am I making that decision? What process am I going through? Or you're an adult buying a new car, or deciding on a job, right? Take a look at that decision-making process. Is it systematic, or do you go with gut instinct? Okay, that might indicate that critical thinking skills regarding systematic decision making might be something you want to develop. Take a look at how you behaved during this last election, for example. If you were generally stuck to a candidate through thick or thin, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not a critical thinker. It means you may have come to a decision about what party you identify or what candidate you identify with it, and stuck with it with good reason. But did you find yourself kind of angry and hostile at any mention of an opposing political party or an opposing political figure, and couldn't think rationally about it, right? That might indicate that you've got to develop critical thinking dispositions to use this tool set, even when you're inclined not to, even when you're faced with a decision that seems so clear cut to you. How could somebody, vote for that monster? How could somebody believe, what that other sort of hideous group believes, right? That indicates that there's probably some critical thinking dispositions you need to develop, including the disposition to keep an open mind, even about subjects you feel strongly about. Okay, so I think, sort of doing an inventory and then sort of starting with one aspect, right? Let's say you want to improve the clarity of your writing, right? If you want to be a journalist, maybe rather than just writing your essays in school or your articles based on sort of, who, what, where, when, why, or an outline of an essay, start thinking about, it in the structure of an argument, right? Does what I'm writing, what is the conclusion I want somebody to believe? What's the evidence I'm providing to support that conclusion? Does that evidence actually support the conclusion? This is a different way of thinking than what's my opening sentence, what are my three sentences in between, what's my closing sentence? This is different than even the sort of who, what, where, when, why of journalism. This is thinking in terms of argumentation. How strong is my evidence? What is my conclusion? Does the argument support the conclude? Does the evidence support the conclusion in my argument? Is my argument strong or weak? These are steps you could take to apply a particular critical thinking skill towards a particular goal, right? Let's say you are deciding where you want to go to college, right? You can start learning about things like biases that distort reasoning, right? Confirmation bias is one that I've talked about before that distorts reasoning because it makes it very hard for us to think about or accept information that contradicts what we already believe. But there's other biases, right? Many kids go to the college that the weather was great when they visited it, right? That's a bias based on the fact if you have a pleasant experience, that's going to cause you to associate that pleasant experience with one choice in decision making, right? This is why lottery ticket sales go up on sunny days. People feel better, they feel happier, they feel luckier. Okay, so that's a bias. So you have to make sure you're not going to choose your college based primarily on what the weather was like when you visited. So one simple way of doing that is, as you're taking notes about when you visit colleges, just note what the weather was like. So when it's a month later, 6 months later, a year later, when you're making your choices, you can sort of determine, are all my top choices, based on just, because I visit on sunny days? I should at least be able to control for that bias. I at least should be able to identify and control for that bias. And we could apply similar critical thinking skills to different decisions we make. So I guess the advice would be, first of all, determine what kind of a critical thinker are you. You'll probably determine that you do think systematically in many instances, particularly practical things like decisions that are important to your life, but you may also make many decisions based on gut instinct, or you may reject thinking about things critically when it's about a topic that you feel fervently about. And then, you got to do the work. If you're not learning these skills necessarily in school, which some you may, some you aren't, then you got to find those resources that you can learn them. You need to learn how to argue effectively. You need to learn how to find and evaluate and use information and arguments. You need how to learn how to identify and control your own biases. And that over time will help you become a critical thinker. And don't forget, being a critical thinker is not something you become and you are one forever. It's a sort of way of life. It's a way you approach problems. It's a way you approach questions. It's not something you necessarily must do with every decision ever. You're not sort of necessarily having to sort of think critically about every subject every day, but it's a toolkit you have for when those important decisions that require systematic reasoning or decisions that would increase the likelihood that you'll make a better decision come along, that you'll have that toolkit and have the dispositions to want to use those tools. Yeah, if you read Critical Thinking, which is my new book from MIT, it has a whole section exploring, what is critical thinking? Where did the concept originate that there's this form of thinking distinct from wisdom and intelligence that we can call critical? And actually, you can trace the concept back to a 20th century public intellectual called John Dewey, who wrote a book called How We Think, that created this concept of reflective thinking, which is really, that's morphed over time into critical thinking. And so you can think of John Dewey's 1910 book, How We Think, as sort of ground zero for critical thinking, the concept of critical thinking sort of entering the world. But over time, many scholars have explored different aspects of critical thinking. And most recently, sort of critical thinking has been applied to critical thinking itself. For instance, critical thinking has historically been about improving the thinking process of an individual. But there's a question of, is thinking simply an individual act? Do groups think? For instance, does thinking taking place in conversations like the one we're having now, in discussions? Is thinking something that doesn't happen within one person's head, but between people? Or are there different types of thinking that go on within individuals and between individuals? So that's one whole aspect of research into critical thinking and debate about critical thinking. There's also concepts of kind of critical thinking fitting into, I think the term critical theory is more coming from kind of postmodern philosophy, but similar notions of, is critical thinking about sort of perfecting one's own individual thinking so you can determine, for example, that an argument is incorrect, versus is critical analysis meant to sort of pierce the veil that we in the world are sort of trapped by discourses, trapped by the language we use, which cannot sort of describe the world as it is entirely. How can we use a sort of critical thinking toolkit to sort of pierce the veil, to explore hidden structures, including hidden power structures behind that veil? There's also a concept of critical action, that once you have used your sort of critical thinking ability to sort of see what's behind the curtain, what are you going to use to change that? Okay. And there's debates within the critical thinking community. I think, people who adhere to what have been conventional critical thinking practices, ones I've been talking about in terms of logic and argumentation and rhetoric, research skills, et cetera, those who claim that those are the skills you need to understand anything, including sort of very complex things like, how the world really works, even in a world where we may not be able to understand it all for a variety of reasons. There's concern that some aspects of critical theory are interested in not how to think, but sort of telling people what to think. And those are all healthy debates, and those are going on. One thing I do know in the book is those arguments, those debates, those discussions are all using the critical thinker's toolkit of argumentation, kind of logic, in order to make their case. So there's room in the world to sort of debate very, very complex things, including very abstract philosophical debates about how the world and the universe work. I think the current crisis is created probably a permanent, at least a permanent infrastructure where teaching will be taking place in blended environments. I don't think we're going to go back to classroom teaching with little to no online activity. There's already obviously quite a lot of online learning going on, particularly in higher ed. I think that'll be sort of filtering down into K-12 now that so much of K-12 education has gone online, for better, for worse. I think, I'm hoping that we'll take the best of what's worked in online and blended learning during this crisis and build on that. I fear that, because so many people were unprepared and so many systems were unprepared, that, if and when, the virus gets under control and we go back to schooling, a lot of people might say, well, thank goodness that's over with. Let's just go back to teaching traditionally. I never want to teach online again. I think what you'll find is over the next 20 years, that some of the things we've learned about the scalability of online education, which techniques work, and also importantly, which techniques haven't worked, which age groups learn well with online elements or blended elements, which don't, that will filter into the educational system. And I'm certainly hoping we'll not move to a system where everything's about sort of scale and productivity, that we can combine the power of being able to teach anywhere using a variety of resources, not just the resources that you can bring into your classroom. Hope those will build into teaching that is more customized to the needs of individual students, which means really understanding individual students, understanding what their needs are, understanding their sort of their cultural background or the ways they learn can be built into their education, making sure that students are not just organized together based on age and zip code, which is basically how we organize schools today, right? Based on where you live and how old you are, you'll be grouped with other kids who live in the same neighborhood and are the same age of you in all your classes, even if you're way ahead in math from that other age group and way behind in reading, for example. So I think the sort of differentiation between learners, being able to target teaching towards the needs of individual students, I'm hoping that will be expanding regardless where the modality is, whether it's going to be in classrooms, online, or most likely some mix of the two. I'm certainly hoping that we'll move from where we are now, where everyone's saying critical thinking is one of the most important skills students can learn, and we should do more of it, but they're not doing it. As I said, 3/4 of employers are saying they're not getting employees who graduated from high school or college who are sound critical thinkers, right? So it's not working. So I'm certainly hoping, whether through the kind of high leverage practices I've been developing or other methodologies, that will move from wanting to teach kids to be critical thinkers, trying to teach kids to be critical thinkers, saying that we're doing it, to actually doing it, to providing them the ability to learn those techniques to be a critical thinker, which means, as you're going through school, whether a fifth grader learning what an argument is, and that there is this thing called reasons for belief that connects the premises of an argument to a conclusion, to middle school, where you're constructing arguments, where you're naming the premises, you're naming the conclusion, and showing the connection between the two, proving your argument is strong or proving an argument is weak, to high school, where you're using all these skills to create powerful arguments that are persuasive as well, or using a whole range of critical thinking skills to prepare for joining the workforce or prepare for college. I think, if what's going to change over the next 20 years, certainly the modality of teaching is going to change. We're seeing it now. The kind of blended learning models and the online learning models that we've seen expanded over the last 10 years, but certainly over the 1 year, are not going to go away. They're just going to become more robust. The technologies become better. We have to hope the pedagogy keeps up with it. We don't sort of race to the lowest common denominator, but we use this technology to make sure education is targeting every student where they are, making sure they are all getting prepared, that we're not leaving some behind in favor of others, but we're heading towards a more egalitarian future where students are prepared in all their courses based on their specific needs. And I think one of their specific needs is going to be need to become critical thinkers and creative thinkers and good collaborators and strong communicators. So that's my hope for the next 20 years. And I think critical thinking will play a vital role as both the subject matter students need to learn, but also the technique we're going to need to use in order to get to a better future, certainly something better than what we have now.